Thank you to the live audience and then those of you online. Today, I want to talk to you about health equity and diversity. But before I get to that, I'm sure you're all wondering, why is there a chief compliance officer up here talking about health equity? So let me give you a little bit of background about me that hopefully will answer that question. Prior to being at FFF earlier in my career, I was at Merck in the legal and compliance departments. And one of my assignments was to support Merck for Mothers, which is Merck's global initiative to help decrease maternal mortality. And when I started supporting that group, I learned just how bad that situation is. And I have to say, I was certainly aware that it was an issue in developing countries, but I was shocked that in the US, and this is in the early 2010s, the maternal mortality rate was 17 deaths per 100,000 births in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And to put that in perspective, other countries, comparable countries, Australia, Spain, Japan, it was about 2 or 3 deaths. So you can see this really was an eye-opener for me. I had no idea that the issue was so bad in this country. And so it really became a passion of mine. I'd like to say that we've done a really good job addressing that situation, but sadly, based on the most recent CDC data available, which is for 2021, our numbers have actually risen to 32 deaths per 100,000 births. And when you look at Black women, that number is almost 70 deaths per 100,000 births. So this is just one of the issues that makes me so passionate about this topic and why I wanted to talk about it today. So we've heard a lot about health equity this week, but I just want to talk a little bit about this topic in the sense of what's going on in our country. And we're all happy that we can be here in person again. The pandemic is over, but there were some silver linings to the pandemic. And for me, one of those is that it really brought issues of health disparities in our country to the limelight. People started seeing that the impact of COVID-19 was actually much greater on communities of color. You had Blacks and Hispanics who were hospitalized twice as often as white people who got COVID-19, and the death rate for those groups was 1.5 times that of white people who got the disease. And it's not just COVID-19, right? It expands across all different diseases in this country. Diabetes, for instance, the death rate for Black people is 2 times that of white people. And cancer, which this is a really interesting one for me, because when you look at incidence rates across all tumor types, the incidence rate for Black people and white people is actually very similar. There really isn't a big difference. Now, if you go and look at specific tumor types, there are differences within those, but across all tumor types. But the death rate from cancer for Black people is higher than white people. So, we really have to look at that and say, what is causing this? That people are getting this disease at the same rate, but somehow our outcomes are different. And I think there are a number of factors that play into that. One of them is later stage diagnoses for Black people, which I think talks about or is relevant to the issues of access, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And there are also questions of treatment, quality healthcare, other issues that I'm going to talk about a little bit more. So I want to focus on diversity. I know you've heard about social determinants of health this week. Diversity is one of those determinants. And when I say diversity, I'm going to talk about race and ethnicity, which actually in this country has a pretty strong correlation with socioeconomic status. So what's the first way in which this impacts health equity is access. So we think about, is there quality healthcare available to people who want to get treatment? And we've heard about the medical deserts that exist in rural areas, where the nearest clinic is 300 miles away. But we even heard Dr. Berger up here earlier this week talk about in Brooklyn, the medical desert that exists there. And so that is a real problem for us. I think we've done a lot in the telehealth space to really address some of those issues. But we heard other speakers who talked about, I think it was Meg, who talked about how her father doesn't have a smartphone, right? So, we still have a ways to go in addressing, if we do have digital solutions, how do we deal with the people who don't have broadband at home, who don't have a computer? How are we going to reach those people? When we talk about access, we also have issues with insurance and payment, affordability. One of the speakers talked about how 50% of the insurance in this country is through employer plans. Well, those are typically only offered if you're a full-time employee. So if you have a part-time job or 3 part-time jobs because you're trying to pay the rent, you're probably not getting access to that affordable quality health insurance, right? You're going on, assuming that you even feel like you can afford insurance, you're going on the marketplace and you're getting less coverage for a higher premium. And so then the question really becomes, do I go seek treatment and maybe not pay this bill this month because my copay or my coinsurance is so high that it really does impact my budget in a way that is not sustainable for me? And that's just talking about care for people when they're sick, right? We're not even talking about preventive care. Certainly there is some level of preventive care thanks to the Affordable Care Act, where there isn't a copay, but I think we still see that there's the opportunity cost, taking time off of work, getting to the appointment. So all of those issues are preventing good access to communities of color in this country. Trust. I think this is one of the issues that we haven't really heard about this week. And anytime you're talking about the quality of healthcare, you have to look at that relationship between the healthcare provider and the patient. And you're not going to have quality care if there's no trust there. A patient who doesn't trust their provider is not going to follow their instructions, is not going to necessarily believe that this provider has their best interest in mind. And so the reason this is such an issue, and why I have it up on this slide, is that we really see a serious lack of diversity in the healthcare field, whether it's providers, people don't see someone who necessarily looks like them when they're going to seek treatment. And that does make a difference in the comfort level, in the trust. And, you really just have to look at the not so distant history in this country of the health system. You look at the Tuskegee syphilis trials, where the subjects of that trial did not consent to be in the trial. And when treatment was available for people who actually were infected with the condition, they were not offered treatment, they weren't given treatment. And so you can understand why there are people in this country who have a serious distrust of the medical community and wonder if they really have their best interests at heart. So we really need to make sure that we're addressing that. And I think the first step to that is to increase diversity in our healthcare system. And the last area is communication. So there's the obvious piece of communication. Are we speaking the same language? Literally. I'm speaking English, you're speaking English, right? But I think it's a much broader issue than that. There are so many people who live in this country for whom English is not their first language. And they function in our society on a relatively high level, going to work, maybe interacting with their children's teachers or what have you, but they are able to get by with their level of English fluency. But when it comes to healthcare, they don't have familiarity with some of the medical terms, some of the diagnoses, some of the instructions for care that providers are sharing with them. And I think there's an assumption on the part of many providers that because this person came in here and is speaking English to me, they understand what I'm saying to them, even though they might not understand, because that lexicon that exists in the healthcare field is not part of their English fluency. So that's an issue. And I think there's another factor of communication. Are we speaking the same language? Meaning, are you and I on the same page. We can use words and they might mean something different to me than they mean to you. I have a story that my friend Lori Myers, who has done a ton of really great work in health literacy at Merck, tells about her experience with health literacy, and she has a very active family. Her children are involved in athletics, and her daughter had hurt her leg, went to the doctor. The doctor said, take it easy for a few days, which Lori interpreted as she should not go to her sports practice and she shouldn't do a workout. But the next day, they went into the city, they walked all around, they went to museums, and not surprisingly, her leg got worse. So when Lori called the doctor was shocked and said, I told you that she needed to take it easy. But to Lori, take it easy meant something different than what the doctor intended. And that's a very basic example, but it just shows you how there sometimes is that disconnect between what the provider is saying and what the patient hears. And when you layer in cultural issues, that becomes even more of a challenge. There are cultures where questioning someone in authority is seen as rude or disrespectful. If you're a provider and you're seeing someone who maybe has that belief or that mindset, making sure that they truly understand what you're saying is really important, so that they don't walk out of the office without an understanding, but afraid to say something. So my title was about health equity and diversity in pharmaceuticals. So I just want to transition a little bit to that. There are a number of touch points that the pharmaceutical industry, and I'm being very broad here, manufacturers, distributors, and prescribers here, but the touch points in the pharma industry, development and delivery, are really the two biggest ones where I think we can make an impact. So on the development side of things, we heard Julie Kim from Takeda talk about how they're working to increase diversity in their clinical trials, which is absolutely critical. We need to do that, but I think we need to take a couple of steps back and think about, how do we identify the areas that we want to research, right? How do we identify where there are gaps in treatment or where we have disparate outcomes? And we need people in that group who are from diverse backgrounds, because that's how those topics are going to come to the forefront. You heard, I think it was Inara up here from Fem Therapeutics talking about this rush of capital coming into women's health right now. And it's because women are starting their own companies and they're addressing those issues because they know them. They know them firsthand, they're important to them. And we need to do the same thing with other diverse communities of color, but things that are important to them. And it starts earlier in the process than recruiting subjects in clinical trials. There's the obvious trial design. You're sitting down, you're making your trial design, inclusion, exclusion criteria. Are we being conscious of whether those criteria are going to inadvertently exclude people of color or other diverse aspects? Those are important pieces when we're talking about our trial sites. Are we making sure that those are put in places that are easy to access for maybe people of a lower socioeconomic class, or in neighborhoods where those people live, so that they can easily get there? And I think it's really important, as we look at that, to incorporate technology there, right? We heard from a couple of different speakers about how, having those touch points be digital really helps to be able to recruit a more diverse subject set. Recruitment materials are also really important. Thinking about how you're going to target the people that you want to get into your clinical trial. Are you advertising in the right places? Are your advertisements in the right language? Dr. Berger talking about how most of his patient population speaks Haitian Creole, right? Putting an English poster up saying, do you want to be in this clinical trial, with pictures of white people, is not likely to get their attention, and they're probably not going to read about it or have any interest in it. And the same goes for social media, or putting things out on the internet. So I think there needs to be a conscious effort to make sure we're increasing diversity in our clinical trials. And the same goes for provider education. When you think about your feeders for clinical trials, Who are your referring physicians? Are you making sure that you are going to places where you're likely to have a higher number of minority patients, so that there is likely to be more minority patients referred into your trial for screening, so that they can become subjects in the trial? And then we talk about delivery. So there's delivery in the literal sense, right? How are we going to distribute these products? And then I think the delivery in the sense of launching and kind of delivering this treatment idea or treatment method to the world, and that comes in the form of education. So obviously we've got right now, these are the three main distribution channels for pharmacy, right? Retail, primary, a way of people getting their prescriptions. And you've got mail order, which is great for people who maybe don't have easy access to transportation or maybe aren't mobile. And then we've got specialty pharmacy, which actually plays a really important role. It's one of the things that I love so much about FFF, that we have New Factor, our specialty pharmacy, but they can really help if you have a product that requires extra attention for the patients, right? Do you have a complicated dosing regimen? Do you have AEs that need to be managed? Are there potential drug interactions? Do you have adherence problems? Those are all things that specialty pharmacy can help to make sure that patients who need that extra attention and extra follow-up get it, and that can help with these disparities in health equity. I think it was really interesting to hear the presentation about Zipline, right? That's yet the next frontier of delivery, right? Or we're using drones, but that's the kind of development, thinking outside the box and using technology to figure out how can we get things to the people who really need them. And then when we talk about education, obviously you're talking about making sure, again, that you're targeting the right places so that people know about the drug. We heard a few speakers talk about getting your FDA approval or clearance for a device is not the be-all end-all of product success, and that is entirely true, because you can be on the market, but if nobody takes your product or nobody will pay for your product, then it doesn't matter, and it's not going to help any patient. So you've got to make sure people understand it, and in the same ways that I talked about educating people about clinical trials, you need to make sure you're educating people. When we talk about patients, the US is one of 2 countries in the world where we can do direct to consumer advertising. So we need to take advantage of that by educating them, not marketing, educating them. At the end of the day, this all relates to adherence, which is a huge issue that creates disparities in health outcomes. And so for the startups out here, for students who are listening, as you're thinking about areas where there is an unmet need, this is a huge one right here when you're talking about pharmaceuticals. So I know I'm out of time. I'm just going to leave you with this topic is such a broad topic. There's so many aspects to it. There's such an opportunity here. So don't think that because somebody else is working on it that you shouldn't work on it too, because we have so much work to do. Thank you.